My name is Gregory Feifer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Current World Affairs. I am also a former fellow in Russia, where I well remember the first time that I had the pleasure of dining at a Soviet restaurant in 1991. A friend and I were lucky to be seated in an otherwise completely empty establishment, staffed by dour-faced waitstaff. Finally, a waitress seated us and presented my friend with whom I was dining and me with a long menu that took a while to study, which was good because in any case, she disappeared for a good long while. And when she finally appeared, scowling, we ordered mushroom julienne, which is particularly good in Russia, even under the Soviet Union, and to which the answer was, "We're out of that." Exasperated by our ignorance. "How about the pork chops?" We asked. "No." "Borscht," because there's never any shortage of borscht in Russia. No. Meanwhile, we were observing a group of waiters going in and out of the kitchen through the front door, carting out cases of beer. Which is unusual because there was a shortage of beer that summer in Moscow, and even the very thin, what passed for beer in the Soviet Union would have been great that very hot summer day. So we asked, what about a beer? The waitress put her hands on her hips, glaring, and said, "Young man, stop clowning around." That was when the Soviet Union was crumbling, but there was one thing that was alive and well, and that was corruption, deeply ingrained as part of everyday life, to which the waiters selling the restaurant's quota of beer for private gain attested very clearly. Of course, corruption has been an integral part of Russian life for centuries, but in the 1980s, an American scholar named James Millar described the late communist version of corruption as the little deal. After the terror and convulsions of Stalinism and the threat to the communist bureaucracy of the reforming Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev came to power on a promise of stability. He couldn't or wouldn't reform the party or Soviet life, and because that's what his promise was, and it became increasingly clear as the Soviet system became bloated and increasingly corrupt at the top that it couldn't continue as it was. And his answer to this, or the ruling oligarchy's answer to this, was to enable corruption to spread to the entire societies. The tacit social contract under the little deal was that everybody could steal from the state if they put up with the system. That was the Soviet form of more equitable social distribution. Corruption became a necessary part of everyday activity. When communism collapsed, it was no surprise that suddenly some people became very rich. You saw the bling and the BMWs when you were living in Moscow. But when I was back in the United States at university, very few people wanted to hear about it. The narrative was all about the market economy and democratization, and there was very little patience for such mushy observations as the broad effects of conditioned behavior on society. Of course, today, it's no secret at all that corruption is central to the Russian economy and politics. It's the way Putin rules the country. Bribes are a part of everyday life. If you're stopped by the traffic police, which is an inevitability almost daily if you drive in Moscow, you pay a bribe to the officer, $10, you get to keep your license. If you're the owner of a corner store, you pay the fire safety inspector, the health inspector, all kinds of other inspectors who come by every day. Now, bribery coerces people because it enables the authorities to prosecute almost everybody. But it also co-opts them by giving them a feeling that they have a stake in the system because they're getting something in return. And of course, the returns are greatest at the top. One eminent economist recently estimated that Vladimir Putin is worth around $100 to $160 billion. So that the president skims $10 to $15 billion a year from the natural state gas company Gazprom, and that's just one company. To legitimize and protect his kleptocracy, Putin is attacking the democratic world order. He's meddling in Western elections, spewing divisive messages on social media, and undermining the unity of NATO and EU countries. Of course, so is our president, but that's a topic for another talk. Now, Putin is doing it to back his claim that he is restoring Russian greatness. And the United States is playing into it as an integral part of this corrupt system, as a place where our rule of law protects the criminal money Putin and his pals are pumping out of Moscow for safekeeping. Billions of dollars are flowing through Cyprus, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and Wilmington, Delaware, and a lot of which ends up in New York City real estate. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse recently decried the United States as now, and I quote, number 2 in terms of the nations that support secret financing and funding and allow for the hiding of assets behind shell corporations. It is one of the defining problems of our time. Whitehouse calls it the real clash of civilizations, not between regions or religions, but between rule of law civilizations and autocracies and kleptocracies. With the rise of right-wing populism, so backed very persistently by the Kremlin, so many of today's big international stories come down to corruption, democracy, and rule of law being undermined by the wealthy and powerful for their own gain. The real battle today is about values. But undermining kleptocracies, such as Russia's, requires knowing about the nature of their cultures. That is, our future is, to no small degree, in the hands of the journalists, scholars, diplomats, and other experts who can understand and explain how populists such as Putin exploit his country's political and socioeconomic culture for his own gain, and how he spreads that corruption around the world, including to our country. So I'm very happy to say that there have been a fair number of such experts produced by the Institute of Current World Affairs since our founding in 1925. I'd like to quote my predecessor, the former executive director of ICWA, Peter Martin, about some of our former fellows in the last 7 decades. David Binder. After decades of isolation behind a Stalinist wall of rigid Marxism, Peter Martin said, Albania finally admits a tiny handful of Western journalists. The first Tirana byline on a front-page lead story in the New York Times is that of David Binder, an ICWA fellow who spent years gaining an understanding of Eastern Europe in the 1950s. In Kenya, constant pressure for democracy is applied to President Daniel Arap Moi by a persistent and hard-headed American ambassador, Smith Hempstone. In 1991, Moi finally gives in and holds multi-party elections. As a young journalist, Ambassador Hempstone learned about East African life, history, and customs as a fellow of the Institute of Current World Affairs. In the 1960s, the President of the United States proposes a new direction for American relations with China. For analysis, the White House calls on Doak Barnett, a senior fellow of the Brookings Institution who carried out his first extensive study of Chinese culture and politics from 1947 to 1950 as a fellow of the Institute of Current World Affairs. These moments occur dozens of times a year, Peter writes, almost inevitably provoking the question, the Institute of what? That is because ICWA, despite the fact that it is nearly 100 years old, has always done its work quietly and individual by individual. Today we have several highly promising fellows examining the cultures of closed societies. David Kenner's fellowship in Saudi Arabia began in April. A former Middle East editor for foreign policy, he arrived in Riyadh to report on how society, especially among young people, is changing under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. In his first report, he wrote about the new phenomenon of women driving Ubers. But despite such outward signs of social liberalization, repression is becoming increasingly and very quickly more draconian and widespread, David says. And it's far from clear the economic reform will transform the country in any way. He says, I'm beginning to think that the sort of grandiose changes they're envisioning are going to take at best decades and perhaps generations, if ever, to realize. Our new donors fellow, Emily Schultz also began her fellowship in April in Berlin, studying the rise of right-wing populism in Germany and its Central European neighbors at a time of fundamental political and social change. Last year, she visited the city of Cottbus, pictured here, where there was a demonstration of supporters of the far-right AfD party. Cottbus is in the eastern state of Brandenburg, a city of about 100,000 people. She said that for her, it was a study in complexity and contradictions. She wrote, "Just like when the local AfD politician from the party that promotes traditional family roles is the one with whom you have a fascinating conversation about feminism in the former East Germany and how important it was for her to work while raising her son." Emily plans to travel to Austria and Hungary next. Matt Chitwood is doing stellar work in China's rural southwestern province of Yunnan, observing radical changes from his base in the tiny village of Bangdong, population 350. For hundreds of years, he writes, Yunnan was best relegated to the barbarians, exotic tribesmen, and desperados of China's wild southwest. Now, as you can see here, partly, it is transforming into not merely a tourist destination, but a critical bridge linking China to Southeast Asia and the world. And he's documenting some of the high-speed rail, road, and other construction that is literally changing the landscape, but he's also documenting how it's changing people's lives. He recently wrote about the rituals honoring the dead, including Tomb Sweeping Day, which includes bonfires and bloody sacrifices of livestock. And he says busy entrepreneurs in the countryside can now hire people to kowtow at their relatives' graves. He says as rural China modernizes, it's unclear how much longer the rituals central to rural life will actually remain real. Matt is actually currently who never published anything in his life before his ICWA fellowship, is now starting work on a book and publishing his work. So in some ways, the transformative effects of the ICWA fellowship that we hope it has on fellows is very real in Matt's case. Karina Peiser is continuing to do terrific work in France, where her fellowship research has broadened from reporting on Muslim integration in public high schools to observing religion and society in general. She recently explored French identity in the wake of the Notre Dame fire, which she says showed us how deeply rooted Catholic culture is in France. But it also symbolized the long and violent rebellion against the Catholic Church, dating back to the Revolution, that resulted in the central state policy of secularism, which is at the center of her inquiries. Karina is returning to the States in September and will be here for our next meeting in December. And finally, our Critchfield Fellow Elizabeth Hawkins departs for El Salvador this month to study the push factors behind why so many are leaving their country to seek asylum in the United States. She'll be focusing on women who have experienced gender-based violence, and she is leaving behind a law practice that she started 10 years ago. She opened a humanitarian immigration law practice, and she is now closing it in order to write about the backstories of the people that she has represented for the past 10 years as an ICWA Fellow, and she doesn't know what she's going to do afterward. We continue the Institute's 90-year tradition, sending fellows like Elizabeth out into the field thanks to your support. But we don't do it merely for them to report on what they see. We search for critical thinkers to develop insight, vision, and new ways of perceiving the world, and to develop the kind of deep understanding of international affairs that future generations will need to ensure that we understand not just facts and figures, but how foreign cultures function and why. And I think that will be crucial for ensuring that America's role in the world will once again be informed by wisdom, foresight, and compassion.